everyone, and welcome again to the Philly Factor. My name is Paul Perrello, and thanks so much for being with us. Today, we have joining us on our program two authors responsible for a book, Bob Crane, The Definitive Years. Carol Ford and Linda Groundwater join us, and happy to say that Linda is actually joining us from Australia, first time on this program. And as I mentioned to both my guests before our interview, first time I think I have actually interviewed someone in real time from Australia. So ladies, welcome to the program. So nice for you to be here. And for Linda, it is the middle of the night for her as we tape this interview. She's up in the wee small hours of the morning in Australia. Carol and myself, we're in real time here in the greater Philadelphia area. Carol, this interview, kiddingly, we said, has been a long time coming. The book has been out for a while, but we planned to do an interview a year ago, literally a year ago, and then that darn pandemic set in. So thanks for your patience in waiting for this opportunity to actually occur.
Thank you so much for having both of us on here today, Paul. It's been a long time, but it'll be worth the wait.
Yeah, for sure. The book is Bob Crane, The Definitive Biography. And some people may know Bob Crane. Some people may have not heard of Bob Crane. And unfortunately for them, they really are missing out on a history of a legendary showbiz entertainer. And one thing that I took away from this, Carol, after reading the book, is that, perhaps I think it's safe to say that most people know Bob Crane because of Hogan's Heroes. And it's not unreasonable to think somewhere across the world today that there's probably a rerun of Hogan's Heroes on. But most people, Carol, know Bob Crane for the role that he played on the CBS television show Hogan's Heroes.
Yes, absolutely. And very little is known about his radio career, even though radio was probably, before Hogan's Heroes, it was probably the thing that he excelled at. People know him for Hogan's Heroes because that was a hit show. But what he was doing in radio was far and away, and I'm sure as you read the book, you realized that was groundbreaking stuff. And so that is something of great importance as far as, his drive in his career in radio. And then in all of his career moves, he was driven to success in all of it.
Yeah. One thing that I took away from it, being a radio guy for like 41 years, is that his style as a radio disc jockey when he was starting out was perhaps something that had not been heard or tried before. And when we think of contemporary radio hosts or disc jockeys, Bob was really out in front of the curve when it came to some of the, I don't necessarily like the term shock jocks, but some of the personalities that actually came after him. He was really at the forefront and a pioneer, if you will, when we talk about, radio personalities.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And he actually didn't want to be known as a DJ. He considered himself a true radio personality because he felt that he was doing way more than spinning records or reading copy. He was actually creating a show and making a sport with it that was far and away different than what had been done, or little bits of it had been being done, but he was taking little bits and piecing them all together to create something that was very unique. And especially way ahead of his time during the 1950s and into the 1960s.
But Linda, even before his radio career took off, he was a musician. He was a very accomplished drummer. Again, not many people know that. They only know this one dimension of Bob Crane, but he really was a well-rounded entertainer.
Absolutely. It was actually one of the first things I learned about him that I had no idea about. Was that Bob had been drumming since he was 11 years old. I mean, he went to the World's Fair in 36 and saw Gene Krupa and said, oh, this is what I want to do. I want to do this. I have to do this. And eventually he got into drumming and he took lessons and he was in school bands and he created his own bands. with friends in school. And if you talk to any of his schoolmates, they would say, that's our little drummer boy. And you couldn't find him anywhere without drumsticks. And it was drumming on the lockers, drumming on the desk, drumming on the books, drumming on the girl in front of him. Music was everything to him. So it remained an important part of his life, to the degree that he had drums on the set of Hogan's Heroes in his dressing room. So if you wanted to know where he was and you didn't know, listen for the drums. Chances are you'll find him.
Well, so given the fact that he died a very untimely, tragic death, and he lived so many years ago, I'll ask both of you, and I'll start with Carol. What made you decide to take up this topic? And Carol, you've written other books, but what made you decide that Bob Crane was going to be the subject that you were going to tackle here? Because the book is quite extensive, and it is called a definitive biography for a reason, because there are those books and magazine articles and newspaper articles that came and went that got into Bob Crane, got into his life and his tragic end. But why did you really dive headfirst into this gentleman?
Well, it was a process, and I have to say that I don't think any one person could have done it. It was definitely a team effort. Linda actually started officially researching his life back in 2004, I believe it was, Linda, 2003. And she, being a broadcaster, being someone in journalism, she had an investigative mind about her to say, this is something that I want to learn more about. And so she did start officially researching him by reaching out and doing what she has been known to do in her other career in radio journalism, which was to start asking for interviews. For me, it was something that I had just always wanted to learn as a kid. So I was doing very elementary research back when I was 15 years old, going to the library, looking things up. Nothing was there really, because it was 1985. So there was no internet. So it was just kind of piecemealing things
Microfiche and Dewey Decimal.
Microfiche, exactly. And then we would be, we're terribly remiss if we didn't mention Dee Young, who brought to us the entire Connecticut radio component and all of her history with Connecticut radio. She worked at WICC for 40 years before she retired a few years ago. She was our key into getting some of the folks that did work with Bob in WICC, who would maybe not have wanted to talk with anybody. Because one of the things that the three of us didn't learn, and learned the hard way, was that it was almost impossible at the outset to get people from his life who were close to him to talk with us, because they had been so badly burned by the media since his death, by things that were coming out that were not true. And then, of course, or in the early 2000s, the film Autofocus, which Linda and Dee and I learned, it was created, it was produced for one reason and one reason only, and that was to sell a film. And it didn't matter if it was true. It didn't matter if it was telling lies without factual fact-checking, you might say, in today's world. But it promoted the image of Bob as someone he was not. And so when we approached, either individually or together, people, we had to really, really work hard at earning their trust. And when we started to learn more and more about Bob, it became a mission, because not only were we learning things about him that were so different than what had been out there in mainline media, but we were also earning trust of these people who were placing their trust in us to do the right thing. And they would say things, thank you for doing this. And, we're in this with you. And these are people from his family, his friends from high school, his colleagues in radio, Hogan's Heroes, acting, and then also the counselor who was helping him at the end of his life. And so it did become something that was way more than just let's go write a book. It was something that was much more passionate and passion driven.
Yeah, Linda, one of the things that I remark at is that the list of people that you outline in the book. I mean, it's not just 4, 5, 6 10
Hundreds.
people, hundreds of people that you have reached out to, the three of you, Carol, as well as DeYoung. I mean, everybody cooperated on this project, including, I believe, some members of his family also agreed to participate, right?
Yes, one of the first people that I was able to make contact with through WICC, which was one of the Connecticut radio stations that really launched Bob into the stratosphere, was his cousin Jim Senich. And Jim is about 10 years younger than Bob, and Bob was his hero, and he just really was so upset with what people thought of his cousin, because that was not what he knew. That's not the person he knew. Those aren't the things that he knew. They were, I remember specifically that there was a television show that made a joke about him, and it really disturbed him and his family. And he said, people probably think that he walked around with horns in his head, but that's not true. It's not who he was. And so he was very, very supportive. And over time, we got other family members and friends and schoolmates and workmates. And it was a long, hard haul, like Carol said. When I started the research on this book, I didn't know anything about autofocus. I mean, I'm in Australia. I don't even know if the film came here. But I was at my mother-in-law's one day watching Hogan's Heroes on cable and said, gee, I haven't seen this show in ages. And I remembered that when I was much, much younger, that Bob had been, that Bob had been killed. And I didn't remember any details except that I wasn't allowed to watch the news. And so I said, well, I'm a grown up now. Let me find out what's going on. And I looked it up and I saw how he had been killed. But then, because autofocus had probably only come out 6 or 8 months ago, the internet was flooded with scandal, with sex, with murder, with sex, with murder, and more sex. And I said, geez, is that all there was here? And I dug a little bit deeper and saw, gee, he was a drummer. Oh, well, I love drumming. Let's learn a bit about this. And he was a disc jockey. I had no idea he was a disc jockey. And I said, gee, I was in radio. This is fascinating. And I started reading other bits and pieces, but I had to keep burrowing past the sex and murder. And I said, this isn't fair. That was pretty much my whole thought process at that moment. I'm a really stubborn person. And I said, this isn't fair. Somebody needs to do something about it. Why haven't they? And so I decided that that was what I was going to do. And so that's how I started my process, which was much less organic than Carol's. Mine was more of just in righteousness of saying it's not fair that any person is known for one thing. And it was when we continued that process and expanded it. And I think before you joined, Carol, I already had Ed Beck, but we hadn't finalized the interviews yet. Reverend Beck was the gentleman who was counseling Bob before he died. And these people were the people that at that time had already agreed were begging for someone to say something other than he was in Hogan's Heroes, he had sex, and he was murdered. And some of those people that are in that book, it took years to get them to agree. Persistence and gentleness. And Robert Clary from Hogan's Heroes was one of those people. The first time I approached him, it was absolutely not, no. And then I tried about a year later with a list. We started sending out a small list of people who had already agreed to see if that would kind of help them. And it was absolutely not, no. And then Arlene Martell, who played Tiger on Hogan's Heroes, as well as, being a guest actress on hundreds of shows in that time period, went to Robert Clary and he said, no. And then about 2 years later, one final go, and I finally got back a yes. And the list was getting longer every time. And so word was eventually getting out that we could be trusted, or they believed we could be trusted with Bob's true story. And we can't really give enough credit to those people who entrusted us. The responsibility of that was not lost on us, but the privilege of that was immense. That here were people who had been waiting, 30 years or more to be able to say, hey, I knew Bob and there's more to this story. And eventually they started coming to us and they'd say, oh, I know this person, I'll go get this person and they'll speak to you. And it just kind of kept growing and growing and growing. And at some point we thought, where do we stop? And we thought, well, we don't. And the more that people want to say, if you want to come to me and tell me one story about one encounter that you had with Bob, we want to hear it. Was it a good encounter? Was it a bad encounter? We didn't know what we were going to find, did we, Carol? We had no idea.
That's right.
All we knew was that we were waiting for stories.
And when we were doing all of this research, and that's a really good point to make, because we were hearing things, from people. When we would get on these calls, and they were with, big Hollywood people, Al Ruddy, who, the Godfather. I mean, come on. And so, he was a co-creator of Hogan's Heroes, but, he calls, and, we didn't know what these folks were going to say. And we were nervous. We live normal lives. And, I
was getting ready for work when Al Ruddy called.
And, so this was pretty big. And we didn't know what people were going to say to us. We didn't know what we were going to get back. And we would kind of hold our breaths, like we wanted to hear good things, but we would hear what they would have to say, good, bad, ugly, whatever. And most of it, there were a couple of bumps in the road, but bumps that make anybody human. I have bumps in my road. We all have bumps in our life stories. And so it wasn't anything horrifying what people, the handful of people who did have some negative things, it wasn't anything that I would be like, whoa, I don't want to put my name on that book. But most of it was, I would say a good 99% was, this was a good guy. I have wonderful stories about him. It's a shame he ended up going down that road. He died way too young. It's a shame he was murdered, but it was the same thing. It almost got on repeat, and it was nice. And I think that's what really then powered us even further to become so invested in it, and to continue to be invested in it, where we do have a podcast, where we do have a website, where we do have social media, where we want to give lectures and talks and things like that, and do interviews like this. Because even though the book is going on 6 years old, it's still his life story. And it doesn't change the fact that there are people out there who don't know his true life story. And so we keep going.
And importantly, too, if I can just add there, we have been asked upon occasion, or criticized upon occasion, for not saying more horrible things about Bob Crane. And, were we hiding things, or, we were only telling the story that we wanted people to hear? And that's absolutely not true. If somebody said things that were unpleasant, and I can think of one off the top of my head, we included them. We didn't set out to say to anyone, just tell me the good stuff.
Sure.
We said, just tell me the stuff. And we'll work out what he was and who he was through whatever it is that you tell me. So when somebody came, to us and said, here's my story, we didn't weed out anything. As a matter of fact, we got to every interview we did. Oh, gosh, every interview was at least 30 minutes. Most were well over an hour. Some stretched for 3 or 4. And some of the particularly close ones were very long interviews. And the truth was that we at some point would say, what about, this other stuff? And most people didn't know about the other stuff. some people started out the conversation. Gary Owens was particularly one of those who said, and I quote, "I'm not going to talk about that." And by the time we got to the end of the interview an hour later, we got to that. And that was simply that most people didn't know, that it didn't reflect in his daily behavior, that it didn't affect their friendship. And so we want people to know that what you're seeing in the book is what his friends and his workmates and his family got. We are just reflecting what these people knew. We aren't hiding bad things or sugarcoating or whatever. What it is what the reality was for the people who knew him. So that's why we do separately deal in a separate chapter this other part of who he was, because it didn't impact every relationship he had.
We're running short on time, but I want to talk a little bit about the end of his life, because Carol, and we talked about this before, it's one of those unsolved murders. I mean, they thought they had a suspect in Bob Crane's death, and then it found, even despite the fact that there was, I guess, some blood evidence, it just turns out that it's one of those cases that have not been solved.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate. I wish they would solve it. I wish they would solve it, because there are so many theories out there that float around. The big one, of course, is the prime suspect, John Carpenter, different from the movie producer or film director, who was his quote unquote friend. That is the one that everybody believes did it. We've heard every theory under the sun. Are any of them valid? I think if you chisel everything down, anybody could make a case about any one of them. But the point is that there is no evidence, no physical evidence to prove it's just, circumstantial or gut feeling or whatever. And so, unfortunately, at this point, I don't think, unless there is some tremendous groundbreaking deathbed confession, or something is unearthed that wasn't before, I don't think it's ever going to be solved, and that's unfortunate. But what I would like people to remember is while everybody is I'm a true crime buff. I enjoy watching Homicide Hunter, just like the rest of them. But beyond that, look at what this man's life was. It's fine to be interested in his death and in the crime, and look to see if you can put all those pieces together and play an armchair detective for an hour or an hour and a half. But remember, this man had a life. He had a family. He had friends. He had coworkers. He had people in his life who loved him and cared about him. And to them, he is more than a headline. He's more than an unsolved murder. He's more than a scandal. Look beyond it and get to know him. Get to know him a little bit, and then make your judgments. We're all sitting here, passing judgments on everybody we see, in the news, in Hollywood, TV, whoever. We pass judgment, but get to know Bob a little bit better than just the headlines, the murder, the headlines, and I think you'll be surprised.
What is it? We're short on time here, but what is it, Linda, that you hope people take away from this book?
Oh, well, I hope that people will take away the idea that celebrity is more than just a public perception, that each person that you see or each headline that you read has a real person behind it. And you may not be getting a whole story. Matter of fact, you're probably not ever going to be getting a whole story. And that a person's life is made up of more than one dimension. Bob, if we take it down to Bob specifically, the perception the public has of him, as I said earlier, was, Hogan's Hero, sex and murder. But he was so much more than that. And he was we often said he wasn't a perfect human, but he was perfectly human. And we all are. And whether your problem is an addiction like Bob had, or whether your problem is that you eat too many donuts on the way to work, it's your business, it's your life, It's your relationships. And for people to have judged him for so many years because of how he died, that they have delved into this, exposed this addiction that he had, that he was trying very hard to fight and had no way of defending himself. It's horrendous. And I hope people learn a bit of a life lesson from that when they read this and say, gosh, what do I not know about other people? What do I not know, about someone else's battle? And maybe I need to be a little less judgmental about that.
Agree 100%.
Well, again, the name of the book is Bob Crane, The Definitive Biography by Carol Ford, Linda Groundwater, and Dee Young. And I want to thank you so much, both of you, for being with us, especially Linda, who joins us from down under, where it is the middle of the night or the wee small.
Going back to bed now.
Go back to bed. I wish you both well. I know if people want more information, Carol, I know you say you do podcasts. Where could they find out more information about the book?
Sure. Everything. We have a website. And it's called voteforbobcrane.org. It's vote4bobcrane.org. Everything is there. The podcast, the book, all of our work, you name it, it's there. That's where you can find it. voteforbobcrane.org.
All right, great. Well, I want to thank both of you for being with us. Carol, pleasure to see you once again, although in the Zoom format. Linda, it's a pleasure to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
And again, the name of the book is Bob Crane, The Definitive Biography. I want to thank both of you for being with us. And to you, ladies and gentlemen, thanks so much for being with us on The Philly Factor. My name is Paul Perrello. We'll catch you the next time around.